Spider-Man 2, a novelization by Peter David. Based on the motion picture screenplay by Alvin Sargent. Screen story by David Koepp and Alfred Goff and Miles Millar. Based on the Marvel comic book by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Chapter 1. Otto Octavius needed several extra arms. Certainly the two he possessed were proving inadequate. Octavius was a darkly complexioned man, stout but reasonably muscular, hair hanging loosely about his face with very little attention paid to tonsorial frivolities. He was in his mid-40s, and had an air about him that managed to be both distracted and intense. In other words, he tended to be very focused on things that had nothing to do with his whereabouts at any given moment. He was busy trying to extricate himself from a taxicab on the corner of 6th Avenue and Greenwich Avenue, at the edge of the university campus. He held a slide carousel in one hand. Tucked in the crook of his other elbow was a folder thick with notes, and he was clutching a briefcase with his remaining free hand. This left him nothing with which to close the door except his foot, and he was having difficulty maintaining his balance. Then the cabbie informed him, with no small sense of irritation, that the 20 Octavius thought he'd handed him was actually a 10. Now he had to try to get at his wallet. He muttered under his breath, trying to figure what he could put down where, and was extremely relieved when a familiar voice called from behind him. "Otto!" A blondish man in a lab coat ran up to him. "Otto, we were supposed to meet at the southeast corner. This is the southwest." "Is it?" Octavius asked distractedly. "I'm sorry, Curtis. I'm not a ship's navigator, you know. Can you lend me a hand?" "If the one will be sufficient, then certainly." Octavius winced as he glanced at the flapping sleeve of Connor's lab coat, pinned at the right shoulder, underscoring the lack of an arm. "Sorry, Curtis," Octavius muttered to Connors. "Yo, buddy!" snapped the cab driver. "I am not your buddy," Octavius informed him archly. "Damn right! What about my money?" "Curtis," said Octavius, nodding toward his right coat pocket, "would you mind pulling out my wallet? The man needs another 10. "Don't worry, it's my treat," said Connors, removing a roll of bills from his pocket and deftly extracting a 10. "Curtis, I can't allow you to—" "Don't be ridiculous. It's my pleasure, Otto," Connors interrupted, handing the money to the cabbie. "It's the very least I can do. After all, you did agree to come down here and speak to my students." "Yes, well, I suppose I did," admitted Octavius. "But I insist on buying you lunch afterward." Having paid the cabbie, Connors took Otto's briefcase to help ease his load. "I truly am sorry about the lend-a-hand comment, Curtis. It was insensitive of me." "Nonsense." "You're a genius hero," said Otto. "Going to a war zone overseas, patching up soldiers, then losing an arm to mortar fire. That was a hell of a thing you did." "Yep, a hell of a thing that ended my career as a surgeon." Connor said it lightly, but Octavius could tell that there was still sting there. "But I went where I was needed, Otto. Molecular biology has been a fascinating field. Students have been just phenomenal." "Anyone with a future?" "A few. One in particular. His name's Peter Parker. Brilliant, but lazy. If he can ever get his mind into his work." "Oh, well, young people," Octavius shrugged. "More often than not, they have their heads in the clouds." Spider-Man swung in a dizzying arc that snapped him around the Flatiron Building and into the middle of Broadway. He fired another web line, and another, swooping from one side of the street to the other. Pedestrians pointed and shouted, "Spider-Man!" People were yanking out their cameras, but he was confident that by the time they managed to get him in their viewfinders, he'd be gone. Even after all this time, he had to admit he got a kick out of it. What he didn't get a kick out of, however, was being late for class. Again. It shouldn't have been a problem. He'd left plenty early, but then he'd wandered into the middle of that daylight holdup, and one thing has led to another, and, well, now here he was, trying to make up for the lost time by webbing his way across town. He had his homework and textbooks snug in his backpack, which was naturally on his back. It lacked a certain coolness factor from a superhero point of view. Then again, he'd never really cottoned to the term superhero that the media loved to bandy about. It was too self-aggrandizing for his tastes. As he drew nearer to the campus, he wondered about the special guest to whom Dr. Connors had alluded at the end of last Tuesday's class. He'd been vague about it, saying only that his special invited guest had some intriguing thoughts and theories that Connors was certain would be of interest to the class. Peter had no idea why Connors was being elusive on the subject of the guest's identity, but he figured the doctor had his reasons. Peter felt a pang of frustration over how things were going in class. Kurt Connors had made it clear that he thought Peter had tons of potential. Potential, Connors never hesitated to point out, that Peter consistently failed to live up to. Well, Peter was determined to turn that around, starting this very day. No more missed classes. No more being late. It was time to get his priorities in order. Granted, he knew he had responsibilities. He had learned that lesson all too cruelly when, 2 years ago, he had stepped aside and allowed a thief to escape from the scene of a robbery. He had done so in a fit of pique, and with a sense of poetic justice. The thief had stolen from a wrestling promoter who had screwed Peter himself over money owed him. As the thief had fled, the promoter shouted in Peter's face, livid over his lack of action. Peter had said with the sort of smug confidence that comes with being truly self-righteous, "I missed the part where that's my problem." It became his problem hours later, though, when the same criminal, searching for a getaway vehicle to steal as police had closed in on him, had stolen the car belonging to Peter's Uncle Ben, the man who had been like a father to him since his youth. Not only had he taken the car, he had also taken Ben's life, coldly shooting him and then hauling him out of the car, leaving him behind on the street like a bag of garbage. Uncle Ben had died, right there before Peter's eyes. The tearful young man had fancied himself grabbing Uncle Ben's soul and shoving it back into his body, but naturally that hadn't happened. Then an enraged Peter had gone after the robber, tracking him down, confronting him, and realizing that his uncle's murderer and the man he'd smugly let run past him were one and the same. That tragic set of events had driven home to him, in a way nothing else could, the truth of something his uncle had said to him. With great power comes great responsibility. At first, Peter had dismissed it out of hand as a cheap aphorism. Now it was his watch phrase, his philosophy, and his reason for living, all wrapped up in a few powerful words. He had done great good as Spider-Man. On the other hand, in some respects, he had taken part in great evil. Foremost was his involvement in the death of the Green Goblin, a.k.a. Norman Osborn, father of Peter Parker's best friend, Harry. Spider-Man hadn't killed Norman Osborn himself. No, he'd simply dodged, just as the Goblin had sent a lethal, pointed vessel of death screaming through the air at him. The Goblin had been run through by his own glider, hanging there on the wall, pinioned like a butterfly. Osborn had gasped out his last words and his last wish. "Don't tell Harry." Peter had honored that. Unfortunately, in doing so, he had committed an entirely new sin. In failing to be honest with Harry, he had inadvertently led Harry to the false conclusion that Spider-Man was, indeed, responsible for Norman Osborn's death. Not only was this naturally of great personal distress to Peter, but it meant there could be no closure for Harry so long as Peter and Spider-Man lived. Harry dwelled on it all the time, it seemed. Over the months it had eaten away at him, body and soul, and Peter was beginning to worry. Bottom line, Harry was his father's son, and who knew what might come of it? After all, nobody knew better than Peter Parker the influence of fathers upon their sons. Look where the influence of his father figure Ben Parker had left him, dressed in garish tights 30 stories above the ground. Harry's sanity was hanging by a thread. Peter was swinging on one. We're all mad here, thought Peter. That was when he heard some sort of grinding noise, like a tank perhaps. Naturally, it caught his attention. What would a tank be doing in the middle of Greenwich Village? He hadn't read anything about an exhibition of military hardware. A parade, perhaps? Or trouble? Spiderman increased his speed a tick, suddenly becoming concerned. He switched to Fifth Avenue because that was the area of the campus that the sound seemed to be coming from. He barreled down it, released the hold on his web line, and soared like a projectile the remaining block, landing squarely on the arch that adorned the middle of the park that served as the campus square. Beneath his mask, his jaw dropped. Okay, that's different, he muttered. So I understand you've got some sort of major microbiological breakthrough in the works, Curtis, Otto said to him as they walked across campus. Right now, Otto, for me the major breakthrough would be if I could finally convince you to call me Kurt. Everyone else who's my friend does. And since when am I everyone else? Octavius demanded. Furthermore, you're dodging the question. How can you tell? Your eyes begin to spin counterclockwise. Connors laughed at that. If you must know, I'm doing some investigation into the cellular regeneration present in lizards, the way they regrow tails. I know what lizards do, but this isn't about lizards, is it? He stopped and nodded in the direction of Connor's missing arm. Are you considering more practical applications? Connor shrugged. I won't say it hasn't crossed my mind. Listen to me, Kurt. All I'm saying to you is, don't do anything precipitous. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing. What I'm telling you is that, even when I was a youth, I always detested the portrayal of scientists in grade B horror films. I know. He waved impatiently before Connors could respond. They weren't even remotely supposed to represent reality. The problem is those were the only portrayals most people ever saw. And perception has a disturbing habit of becoming twisted into reality. And those scientists would always be involved with some sort of wild experiment, always be in a damned hurry to test it. And the next thing you know, bam, they're 50 feet tall and destroying a city. Or they're radioactive, or they have X-ray eyes and can see through women's clothing. He paused and said, All right, that one I never minded so much. Connors laughed. Lonely as a young man, were you, Otto? Which one of us wasn't? What you have to remember, Kurt, is we're scientists. To many people, even in the real world, that alone makes us monsters. And not just from the way they've seen us portrayed in movies. It stems from the fact that we challenge the most fundamental beliefs there are. They tell us that the earth was created in a week, that man was dropped fully made into the Garden of Eden, ready to go. And we come back and say the earth took billions of years to form, and, by the way, here's evolution to chew on. But we're not monsters. We must never lose sight of that, lest perception shapes the reality once more. My, you're in a mood today, Otto. Is this what you're planning to discuss with my students? I could discuss a great many things. What did they say they were interested in hearing about when you told them I was coming? Ah, Connors waggled a finger at him. I never told them it was you. I was purposely vague about it. Octavius stopped in his tracks and stared at Connors. You didn't tell them? Why on earth not? Because, Otto, until you stepped out of the cab, I wasn't certain you were going to show, and I didn't want to disappoint them. Curtis, how could you say that? Demanded Octavius. I made a commitment. You have exactly 2 commitments in your life that mean anything to you, Otto, said Connors, ticking them off on his fingers. Your wife and your work, and not even always in that order. Tell me, how many times did Rosie have to remind you that you were supposed to come here today? I have no idea what you're... How many? He prodded gently. 18, Octavius admitted. Maybe 19. But I was busy. You always are. Did she put you in the cab? Yes. And tell the cab where to go? Octavius slumped his head, defeated. All right, fine. You win. It's probably better that you didn't tell them in case I... Forgot? Again, Connors laughed, and he patted Octavius on the back. Otto, if Rosie weren't in your life, you'd have had to invent her. Believe me, I know that all too well. If it weren't for... A faint vibration shook the ground beneath them. Otto looked at Connors and said, Are there fault lines beneath Manhattan? I'm not a geologist, Otto. Curtis, said Otto, feigning shock. How could you say that? Connors rolled his eyes. Sorry, seismologist. Thank heavens. I would have expected that. Oh my God, Connors suddenly said, his eyes widening, and Octavius turned to see what had so distressed him. What the hell? Breathed Octavius, no less surprised. A vehicle that looked like nothing so much as a giant robot was charging across the quad. It had to be at least 15 feet tall, and appeared to have stepped directly out of one of those Japanese animation cartoons. The legs, however, weren't moving independently of each other, but instead were mounted on huge caterpillar treads. People were scrambling to get out of its way, and that was fortunate because it paid no heed to whatever or whomever lay in its path. Trees, park benches, a couple of concrete tables erected to play chess upon, all were crunched under it as it made a beeline directly toward Octavius and Connors. Octavius stood rooted to the spot. He was able to make out a human face peering out through some sort of clear window situated in the chest area. The person appeared to be male, with a shaved head, and he had a demented grin. Otto, come on, shouted Connors. There's a giant robot coming this way. I don't know that it's technically a robot, muttered Octavius. There appears to be a human operator within. I believe that for it to be a robot, it needs to be able to function independently of... Otto! Oh, right. Coming. They dashed along the sidewalk, Otto weighed down by the briefcase and teaching materials he was carrying. They were running well clear of the mechanoid's path, so Otto cast a glance over his shoulder. Kurt, I believe we may have a problem. I think it's following us. Connors turned and saw that his friend was right. The robot had changed course and clearly was in pursuit. Instantly, he dropped the materials he'd been carrying. Octavius looked at him accusingly. Curtis, we're going to need those for... Connors didn't hesitate. He reached over with his one arm and knocked everything out of Otto's arms, sending it tumbling into the sidewalk. Have you lost your mind? Demanded Octavius, shouting above the rumbling. No, but you may have. Run! Connors immediately began running again, and Octavius had to choose between stopping to pick up his falling materials or matching Connors' actions. He chose the latter, and within seconds the two scientists were pounding along the pavement, the robot coming right after them. You know, we can move much faster, now that we're not carrying my books, Octavius called to Connors. Connors glanced at him incredulously. Just ahead of them was the student center, which seemed their closest chance for refuge. As they bolted for it, there was the sound of something snapping out, rather like a whip. Suddenly, Octavius found his arms pinned, and he was yanked to a halt. He looked down and discovered that a thin cable had dropped down over his torso like a lasso. Twisting his head around, he saw that it was anchored to the mechanoid that had been pursuing them. It had ground to a halt. The face in the machine was grinning wildly. Otto! Shouted Connors, who had stopped running and turned to help his friend. This is intolerable treatment, Octavius declared. And then the cable yanked him firmly in the opposite direction. He was snapped through the air, hauled toward the mechanoid as he continued to protest. Spider-Man's eyes widened beneath his mask as he swung down toward the campus and gaped at what he was seeing. A giant robot, of all things, was hauling a man across the ground right toward it. A lower section had slid open like a bread drawer, and the man was being pulled in, kicking and shouting. The moment it snapped shut, his voice vanished. The first thing Spider-Man did was glance around to make sure there weren't any movie cameras to be seen. Because it was so bizarre, he wouldn't have been surprised to find that he had wandered into the middle of a film shoot. Unfortunately, there were none. Even more astonishing, he saw Dr. Connors standing there, shaking his fist in an impotent fury. The robot ignored him, pivoting on its treads and rolling away. Spider-Man swung down toward the robot like a guided missile, released his web line at the last moment, and landed on the robot's back. He looked for an opening, a weak spot, something he could attack. But the robot appeared seamless. He was reasonably certain, though, that he'd seen some sort of viewing port. Quickly, he scuttled around the robot to the front, and found himself staring in at a bald man with a surprised expression. "Spider-Man!" came the voice of the controller, issuing over a hidden speaker. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice sounded distinctly Australian. "Oh, just hanging around," replied Spider-Man. "So you coming out of this thing voluntarily, or do I have to pull out my can opener?" The robot rolled to a stop, and for a moment Spider-Man thought this was going to go easily. Then he saw the arms of the robot lift up on either side, snapping into attack position, and he realized such was not the case. They angled toward him, huge vice grips on the end of either arm rather than fingers. Fortunately, they were moving relatively slowly, and Spider-Man was able to dart between them, never losing his grip upon the robot's surface. In the meantime, he kept looking for some weak spot where he could get a grip, rip the robot open, find some wiring, and tear into it. Certainly that would be enough to bring this thing to a halt. He moved to the back of the robot once more, and the vice grips tried to get at him, but there was restriction in the arm's range of movement. The guy inside, presuming he was the designer, hadn't given them full 360-degree rotation. With any luck, that would prove to be a fatal mistake. Looking closely, Spider-Man saw that there were, indeed, seams, but they had been welded over. "Okay, fine. Then I'll just have to make my own fun." He proceeded to slam the metal surface repeatedly with his fists. At first, there was no sign that he was doing damage, but as the surface shuddered under the blows, dents started to appear. "You're on the verge of making problems for me, Spider-Man," grated the mocking voice through the speaker. "Guess I'll have to return the favor." The entire robot suddenly began to tremble, then to shake violently, and Spider-Man felt substantial power building up at the base of the mechanoid. "Oh man," he groaned. "You've got to be kidding me." Seconds later, his worst fear materialized. The robot lifted off the ground, driven by nothing less than rocket power. Slowly at first, and then faster, it blasted skyward, with Spider-Man holding on for all he was worth. New York City was a blur below him as his mind raced, trying to figure a way out. He was starting to be faced with the realities of drag as the high wind threatened to overcome even his incredible adhesive power. Suddenly, he felt something at his back. He'd been distracted, and the robot's arms were snapping at him again. He twisted away and flattened himself against the robot's back. Determined to end the confrontation, he skittered around to the front of the robot. The mechanoid began angling to the right, left, up, and down, trying to shake him loose. Spider-Man moved around so that he was facing the operator once more, and he started pounding on the viewport. "No way you're getting through that," laughed the man within. "That's triple ply reinforced." But then the laughter trailed away as cracks began to, appropriately enough, spiderweb through the viewport. Spider-Man kept pounding on it, and then his spider sense warned him of danger. One of the vice grip arms was descending right toward him. The world seemed to slow down around him, and he waited for the right moment. Just as the vice grip was about to grab him, he twisted clear, stood, and grabbed it. Using the arm's own momentum against it, he slammed the claw down with all the strength he had. The grip drove down and shattered the viewport. The man inside let out an alarmed scream as Spider-Man reached in a gloved hand and grabbed him by the throat. "Do you remember being born?" demanded the web-slinger. What? Do you remember being born? No, you lunatic. Of course I don't remember. Fine then. It went something like this. And he started to pull the man out through the narrow space, head first. The man screamed at the top of his lungs. Don't! Don't! I'll set us down! I'll set us down! Back at the university. Alright, yeah, alright. Spider-Man released his grip on the man and glared at him balefully, which naturally the guy couldn't see because of the Spider-Man mask. The thoroughly cowed pilot was as good as his word. Within minutes, the robot was coming in for a landing back at the central quad. When people saw that Spider-Man was astride the robot, they began shouting and cheering, waving fists in appreciation. Let the guy out. Now, ordered Spider-Man. The pilot nodded numbly, manipulated some controls, and the hatch snapped open. A man stumbled out of it, gasping for breath, looking around in confusion. Spider-Man, meantime, had gotten a solid grip on the front of the robot now that it wasn't moving. He pulled, with a grunt, and the front section of the mechanoid ripped away. Sparks flew and the robot shuddered violently, then shut down. Gripping the pilot by the front of his shirt, he pulled him close and snarled, "We're having words, you and I." He fired a web line, and seconds later he was hauling the squirming pilot upward. The man let out a satisfying screech of terror as he swung higher and higher, tucked under Spider-Man's arm, his arms and feet flailing wildly. "I wouldn't thrash much if I were you. I might drop you," Spider-Man pointed out to him, whereupon the man promptly went limp. Octavius sagged against the side of the fallen robot, breathing heavily. The air had been getting stale inside that insane mechanism. People were clustering around him, shoving in close, all asking him if he was all right, and what was up with the robot, and 100 other questions. He flinched back, trying to ward them off. "One side," came the angry voice of Curt Connors. "Move. Any student within the sound of my voice who doesn't get out of the way is going to see his GPA go down the toilet, I guarantee it." That was more than enough to cause the crowd to part, and Connors reached his grateful friend. "Oh, thank God," muttered Octavius. "Otto, are you all right?" "Truth to tell, I've had better days," admitted Octavius. "Curtis, do you think we might be able to postpone my talk with your students? I don't exactly think I'm up to it right now." Yes, of course," Connors assured him. "Some people helped me gather your belongings. I was going to send them to Rosie. In case I didn't make it back? Very considerate." He patted Connors on the shoulder. "Very well-ordered priorities. We'll make a scientist of you yet, Curtis, even if you don't know the difference between a geologist and a seismologist." Connors looked at the robot in amazement. But who was this person? What did he want you for? Not a clue. And not that I'm knocking it, but what am I doing back down here? "It was Spider-Man, dude," said one of the students nearby, and others were nodding their heads. "Spider-Man?" Octavius asked Connors. "That lunatic who goes about risking his life helping people?" "Apparently so." "Huh," said Octavius thoughtfully. "Apparently it takes a crazy man to stop a crazy man." "You're crazy, man!" The former robot pilot was dangling upside down as Spider-Man looked down at him, casually holding a web line that was attached to the pilot's right foot. "You're crazy!" he howled again. "You have no idea," replied Spider-Man. If there was anyone he'd ever considered dropping from this height, 10 stories high as he stood on the edge of the rooftop, it was this guy. Clearly he wasn't going to make it to class, which wasn't going to endear him to Dr. Connors. He was supporting the dangling man's weight with one arm, and now he started rubbing that arm's bicep and saying, "You know, I think I may have strained this muscle while you were trying to smack me around on Gigantor back there. Not quite sure it has the strength it normally does. Please let me down." "Down isn't your problem," Spider-Man reminded him. "Staying up is the problem, and you'll only be doing that for as long as I feel like keeping you there. The speed with which you go down is dependent entirely on how reasonable you're prepared to be." Anything! Oh, good. Okay, question number 1. Who are you? Jack! Jack All! Spider-Man just stared at him. You can't be serious. Full name's all right, but I go by Jack All. It's my alias, okay? Brilliant. There's a name that'll strike fear into the hearts of millions. Hey! The guy sounded annoyed. Like Spider-Man is any great shakes. How long did you have to think to come up with that one, eh? Why not something really creepy, like the human spider? I thought of that, actually, Spider-Man said a bit too defensively. But there was this guy, and he... Not caring! Okay, fine. Spider-Man shook him a little to regain control of the situation and was rewarded with a terrified yelp. Who was that guy you grabbed? Otto Octavius! Spider-Man kicked himself mentally. Of course. How could he not have recognized him? He'd been following the man's work for ages, discussed him at length with friends who, more often than not, were just pretending to understand what he was talking about. In this case, he supposed he could be forgiven, since he'd only gotten quick glimpses of the man in all the confusion. But certainly he'd seen his photo enough times in Scientific American. Nevertheless, he decided to respond in a guarded fashion. No sense letting Upside Down Boy know that Spider-Man was a science guy. Who? Octavius! Otto Octavius! He... And then Jack All passed out. At first, Spider-Man thought the guy might be faking it. He shook him a little, even mimed releasing the web line. There was no reaction. Man, they're just not making criminal masterminds the way they used to, he said to himself as he hauled the guy up to the roof. He dumped the limp body there, then lightly slapped his face a couple of times while saying, "Wakey, wakey." The guy stirred and then gasped as he found Spider-Man staring down at him. He looked down frantically, thoroughly disoriented. "Otto Octavius," prompted Spider-Man. "Oh, right," grunted Jack All. He sat up, running his hand over his bald pate. "He's a scientist, doing research. I figured he could be of use to me." "Wait a minute," Spider-Man said, acting as if he were trying hard to recall something, rather than knowing it off the top of his head. "I read about him somewhere, I think. Something to do with some sort of energy source?" To his surprise, Jack All let out a dismissive snort. "If you think I care about that, Spider-Man, then you don't know Jack All." "You've probably been waiting this whole time for a chance to say that," accused Spider-Man. "Well, kinda, yeah," Jack admitted. "Alright, so if it's not an energy source, it's the other thing." "What other thing?" Jack glowered at him. "The weapon. Octavius isn't a weapons maker." That seemed to amuse Jack tremendously. "No, he's not. And he's not intending it as a weapon. But he's working on something that could be one. Stupid bugger probably doesn't even realize it." He pulled a battered packet of cigarettes and a lighter from his pants pocket. "Lucky these buggers didn't fall out, what with all that dangling." "Do you mind?" he said. "Go right ahead, kill your lungs, see if I care." Jack nodded and lit up a cigarette. Then he tucked the pack in his shirt pocket. "How do you know about it?" Spider-Man asked him. "This weapon." "Heard tell through the grapevine. I would have tried to snatch Octavius at his lab, but I didn't want to take a chance of messing with what he was cooking up in there. It's got that much potential, is what I hear." He nodded his head in the direction of the university. "Bottom line, mate, I'm a merc, strictly freelance. And I'm a techno junkie. Whipped up that little battle shell there. And it ain't bad. Not at all. But Octavius, without even trying, may well have outdone me. So I nabbed him because I wanted to pick his brain. Find out the details. Find out how it works." "How what works?" Spider-Man said in exasperation. "The arms, mate. The arms." "What arms? What are you..." Suddenly, Jack All flipped the cigarette in Spider-Man's direction. His spider sense screamed a warning at him, and he desperately backflipped to get out of the way. He didn't entirely make it, and the cigarette exploded in a fireball. It knocked him clear to the other side of the roof. As he scrambled to his feet, he heard screaming. Jack All was staggering around on the rooftop, slapping at himself frantically. He was completely aflame. Apparently, all the cigarettes he'd had on him were likewise incendiary devices. A stray flame from the one he'd just set off had struck his chest and ignited the rest of them. His screams were horrifying, and Peter mused that burning to death had to be just about the worst, most painful way that someone could die. Fortunately enough for Jack All, that wasn't to be his fate. His back leg hit the edge of the roof, and he toppled over. Spider-Man fired a web line, and it snagged him just before he went. But the heat of the flame promptly sizzled through the gossamer threads, and Jack fell off the roof. Spider-Man vaulted from one end of the roof to the other, but knew even before he reached the other side that he was going to be too late. He was right. He peered over the edge of the roof and saw the burning and motionless body of Jack lying on the ground. People were backing up, some screaming, and someone was running at Jack All with a fire extinguisher that wasn't going to do a bit of good. Then people started pointing upward at him, shouting things. Even at this distance, he was able to discern what they were saying. "Spider-Man! What the hell did you think you were doing? Why didn't you save that guy? Maybe he pushed him. Someone down there could have been killed, you freak!" He sighed heavily, fired a web line, and swung away. As he did so, his thoughts kept wandering back to Otto Octavius. What had Jack been talking about? Arms? Was Otto Octavius becoming some sort of weapons developer? Had he taken on some contract for the military? That didn't sound like him, though. Certainly not based on anything that Peter had read. Peter felt adrift. There was no one he could ask about it, and he had no way to follow it up. This Jack guy had obviously been deadly serious, but Peter just couldn't fathom what any of this was about. Perhaps he should ask Dr. Octavius. And how precisely was he supposed to do that? Stroll up to the guy and say, "Excuse me, are you involved in some sort of arms program that could attract the interest of mercenaries? No offense." Yes, definitely, that was sure to work. Crackerjack plan. Inform the authorities? They'd want to know how he knew what he knew. If he contacted them anonymously, they'd likely pay him no mind. If he went in as Peter Parker, they'd ask him all sorts of very uncomfortable questions. And if he went as Spider-Man... Well, thanks to J. Jonah Jameson's constant diatribes in the Daily Bugle, he had the credibility of a dirty politician, a terrorist, and a shyster lawyer all rolled into one. Still, reading up on Octavius, doing a little digging, that might not be such a bad idea after all. If nothing else, he might be able to find out just what sort of arms might be worth dying for. Chapter 2. "The first time I found myself in your arms, I thought I was going to die," said John Jameson. John was a tall, strapping young man, with a square jaw and closely cropped brown hair. His eyes spoke of quiet intelligence, and his entire demeanor conveyed someone whose nature was to remain calm and collected, no matter how stressful the situation. It made him the polar opposite of his father, who could be counted on to fly off the handle at the slightest provocation. He was sharply attired, having chosen to wear his Air Force dress uniform for the occasion. The circumstances were right for it. Lunch at an extremely fashionable and, frankly, snooty men's club. His father loved to make a fuss over the uniform, especially the medals that gleamed on the chest, and he wanted his dad in a good mood. Whereas the club itself was men only, one of the last bastions of such gender segregation, they had opened the main dining room to women, provided they were accompanied by a club member, of course. This had been done to prove that the club was willing to change with the times, which it wasn't really, but the management had done it so at the strident advice of its attorneys in order to avoid lawsuits. The change in policy was fortunate for John, since he had his girlfriend with him today. She sat next to him in the back of the limousine that had been sent for them. She had long red hair, a round face, and eyes that sparkled with laughter. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" she asked of his declaration. "Well, of course. It meant that I was so filled with joy that it was all I could do to keep myself from dropping dead of ecstasy." "Ah, that's good, because, I don't know," she said, and her voice was slightly sing-song. "See, to me, it made it sound like I was some sort of vampire or something. That the moment I had my arms around you, that's when you spotted the fangs and knew that you were in a world of trouble." He shook his head. "That's quite the imagination you've got there. How is it that someone so fundamentally upbeat is able to come up with a worst-case scenario out of thin air, no matter how positive the inspiration?" "Practice. Years of practice." With that, her voice had become uncharacteristically somber, and he leaned over toward her, nudging her shoulder with his own. "Something bothering you?" "Nah, it's nothing." "Honey, what's wrong?" "I told you, it's all good." "Yes, you told me that," he said firmly, "and you can see by the look on my face that I'm not buying it. Now spill." "Now spill. Sounds like some old crime drama where the..." "Honey." The sharpness in his tone brought her up short. "I'm just a little nervous, that's all." "About what?" "Well," she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, smoothing the front of her skirt. "It's just that I've never had much luck with fathers. My own father was..." Her voice trailed off. "I thought you'd sorted things out with your dad." "I thought you'd sorted out things with your dad," he said gently. "That he changed at least a little after he and your mom broke up." "He has. A little. I mean, we can actually, spend time in the same room now. But he still acts like a jerk sometimes. In those 18 years when he was doing it regularly, berating me, beating me down. Takes a toll, Yeah, I know. Plus, there's the fact that the last time I met a boyfriend's father, it didn't exactly go well. He was kind of mean. So mean it wound up killing the relationship because my boyfriend took his dad's side and, she shrugged helplessly. That was kind of that. If the relationship was so fragile that it couldn't withstand a disapproving parent, then it wasn't that strong to begin with, honey. Ours is made of sterner stuff than that. You think?" He squeezed her hand firmly. "I'm sure of it." Then he grinned encouragingly. "Besides, don't worry about it. See, my dad has yet to approve of a single girlfriend of mine he's ever met, and never once has a relationship gone bust because of it." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, well, that's great, John. If it wasn't his disapproval that killed the relationships, what was?" "Well, jealousy, for one thing. See, I was so much prettier than they were, which isn't a problem in our case," she assured him teasingly. "Of course. Plus, I wouldn't leave the space program for them." She turned and stared at him with genuine surprise. "Really?" "Really." "But why? I mean, to me that's so amazing what you do." "And dangerous. They'd hear about the accidents and be worried I was going to be blown to bits due to some malfunction. Because as soon as something goes wrong, millions of Americans listen to CNN and suddenly everyone's a rocket scientist capable of second-guessing everything NASA does." He studied her thoughtfully. "So it doesn't bother you, what I do for a living?" "Of course not. I know it's dangerous, but it's part of who you are. So much a part of you that I have to accept it." "You know what, honey? Just say that to my father, and I guarantee you everything's going to go just fine. And by the way, anyone who would toss you aside just because his father acts like a jerk deserves to be your former boyfriend." "Oh! Oh, what?" "We're here," he said, leaning forward and peering out the window. The limo pulled up in front of the Ascot Club, situated in a neatly adorned brownstone on Lexington Avenue. The chauffeur came around and opened the door next to John's girlfriend. She sat there, hands on her lap. Then, to John's confusion, she reached over and pulled the door shut. Honey? Okay, one other thing, she said. In the interest of, total honesty. Yeah? He prompted warily. I have a friend and, well, he sort of works for your father. Peter Parker? She blinked in surprise. How did you know? I've seen his photo credits in the paper, and you've mentioned him by name a few times. Like, as my friend Peter Parker always says, that kind of thing, so I made the connection. Oh, I didn't know. This is kind of awkward, then. I didn't want you to know that it was Peter who, Let me guess, John grinned. He's had less than flattering things to say about my dad. Horror stories, in fact. And you don't want to get him in trouble because he was the one who said them, but because of what he said, it makes you nervous about meeting Dad. Is that in the ballpark? Right down the middle of home plate, actually. Honey, he shook his head. You think I've known my father all these years and remained unaware of how he can be with people? Not just girlfriends who he thinks aren't good enough for me, but everyone? He can be bellicose, bombastic, and many other B words whose definitions I'm shaky on, she said. The point is, you shouldn't think that's all there is to him. Because he's still my father. He wants me to be happy. And deep down, he's a caring, affectionate guy. When she stared at him, he added, deep, deep down. Way deep. Mariana's Trench deep. Terrific. Honey, do you trust me? Yes, of course, she said impatiently. Then shouldn't that be all that matters? I guess. You guess? She steadied herself and obviously forced a smile. You're right. It's just me and my baggage. It'll be fine. Oh, she added urgently. You won't mention what I said about Peter, right? What, mention to Dad that he's pissed off one of his employees? Boy, is that the worst kept secret of the year. But yes, don't worry, not a word. Thus assured, she opened the door of the limo. The chauffeur, now confident that she was going to emerge, caught the door as it swung, and opened it the rest of the way, helping her to step out onto the curb. Together, their arms linked at the elbow, they entered the main foyer. J. Jonah Jameson was waiting for them, looking pointedly at his watch. Our reservation was for 10 minutes ago, he said, his mustache bristling. Traffic, Dad. Traffic? Bellowed Jonah, approaching him. How could traffic possibly be a bother to you? My son, the astronaut. Traffic is for mere mortals. You should be able to leap over it in a single bound. I could have if I'd remembered to wear my tights and cape. Sorry. Don't let it happen again, said Jonah, embracing his son warmly. Then he looked at John's companion. And who is this? Dad, may I present Miss Mary Jane Watson. Mary Jane, my father, J. Jonah Jameson. What's the J stand for, Mr. Jameson? She asked. Jolly, deadpanned Jonah. And please, Mr. Jameson is so formal. Call me... He stopped, considered. No, on second thought, Mr. Jameson will do. Now come on, we're 11 minutes late and counting. They followed in his wake, walking briskly through the corridors, and arriving at the dining salon less than a minute later. The walls were deep, rich oak, lined with scowling paintings of famous members of the club going back centuries. If even one of them could have seen women eating there, they'd have died a second time. Once seated, menus in front of them, Jonah stared at Mary Jane, his eyebrows furrowed. You look familiar, Miss Watson. Have we met before? I don't think so. I've seen you, though. I never forget a face. Mary Jane's an actress, Dad, said John helpfully. Oh, and there's my billboard. That's gotta be where you know her from, Dad, John assured him. There's this billboard out 20 times bigger than life with her face plastered all over. Osborn's kid. Harry, Jonah said abruptly. Mary Jane paled visibly. What? You used to go out with Norman Osborn's kid, Harry, said Jonah, pointing at her. Isn't that right? Yes. She glanced at John to see his reaction. How did you... Ha! And Jonah thumped the table triumphantly. Sherlock Holmes lives. Can't slip anything past me. Mr. Jameson, Mary Jane said cautiously, I wasn't trying to slip anything past. How did you...
Saw photographs of you with him. Parker snapped them during that whole World Unity Festival debacle, right before that armored nut attacked.
Parker, John said, taking exaggerated pains to explain, is one of Dad's photographers. Peter Parker, I think his name is. Right, Dad?
That's him. And I remember looking at that photograph and thinking, I wonder if young Osborn is paying for her time.
Dad! Mary Jane's jaw dropped, but before she could say anything, Jonah added,
Believe it or not, young lady, that was intended as a compliment.
She found her voice, although it wasn't easy. I was leaning toward or not, actually.
All I was saying, Jonah informed her, was that considering how weak-kneed and unpromising a man young Osborn was, his own father's assessment, by the way, I was amazed how he was able to engage the interest of such a striking young woman.
Well, thank you, I guess, she said uncertainly.
What were you doing with young Osborn, though? Jonah demanded.
Dad, I don't see how it's any of your business.
She's dating you. That makes it my business.
John, Mary Jane put up a hand. Your father's right. It is his business. The fact is, Mr. Jameson, there was more to Harry than his father gave him credit for. Maybe I just saw things in him that his dad didn't, but might have eventually if he'd lived long enough. And let's face it, not every son is as lucky as John. To have a father who's perceptive enough to see all his potential. I mean, you had to have been supporting John for many years for him to get to where he is today, true? A son like this doesn't just spring up out of nowhere. He's molded and shaped by a father with vision. Jonah considered that, rubbing thoughtfully at his chin.
That's very true,
he said at last. John brought his hand up, covering his mouth to hide his grin. Mary Jane leaned forward, warming to her topic. The fact is, sometimes I think John doesn't realize how lucky he is to have a father like you.
See there, Jonah demanded, thumping John on the arm. How many times have I told you that, eh? And you ingrate, you never believe me. You just smile that perfect smile, which is only there thanks to the braces I funded, thank you very much.
You wore braces? Mary Jane stifled a laugh. Don't start, John warned her. Jonah continued.
And you say to me, of course, Dad, whatever. What is this whatever young people are always spouting about these days?
He asked Mary Jane. She propped up her chin and gazed at him doe-eyed. As far as I'm concerned, it's what they say when they realize their parents have pretty much won an argument and they just don't want to admit it. Jonah Jameson thudded the table with such vehemence that he almost knocked over the centerpiece. John quickly grabbed for it and just managed to prevent it from toppling over. Oblivious, Jonah bellowed so loudly that heads turned throughout the room.
By thunder, John, this girl is a treasure! A treasure!
By the way, Mr. Jameson, said Mary Jane, clearly deciding to push her luck. I hope I'm not being too forward here, but I simply have to say that's very exciting hair you have.
Really?
Jameson grinned broadly.
Who says you can't get a good $2 haircut anymore?
Not me.
I trust my barber,
he said sincerely. It's trust well placed, Mr. Jameson. He displayed his teeth, stained yellow from cigar smoking.
Call me Jonah.
For the second time in the afternoon, John Jameson went slack-jawed. His father fired him a look.
What are you gaping at? Haven't you ever seen two people bonding before?
Yes, said John cautiously. It's just, you were never one of them. Jameson waved him off dismissively and turned his attention back to Mary Jane.
Where did you two meet?
Well, actually, I bet you can figure it out, Jonah, Mary Jane said challengingly. You know I'm an actress. So what do most actresses spend most of their time doing to make a living?
Waiting tables,
Jonah replied instantly. He glanced from one to the other.
You met her when she was working at a restaurant?
You're amazing, Mary Jane said, and turned to John. Isn't he amazing, John? As far as John was concerned, Mary Jane was the amazing one. Actually, Mary Jane continued, it was more than just meeting. John bailed me out of a rather dicey situation. Mary Jane had it. It was bad enough waitressing at a dive like the Moon Dance, knowing that only the money passed under the table was keeping the Board of Health from closing the place down. Bad enough that the food was for crap and that the boss, Enrique, was constantly on her case. But when the burly trucker reached over and pinched her backside for the third time in 5 minutes as she went past, that was it. Mary Jane spun, glared at him, and dumped a plate of spaghetti into his lap. The guy leapt to his feet with a strangled yelp, and Enrique bolted out of the kitchen in response to the shout. Mary Jane stood in front of the trucker, arms folded, looking defiant. "You did that on purpose," he bellowed. "It slipped," Mary Jane said, but she didn't sound convincing, nor was she trying to. "You apologize to the man right now," Enrique told her. When she hesitated, he shouted in her face, "Do it or you're out of here." She hesitated, her resistance beginning to slip. And then a calm, commanding voice said, "Don't do it." Mary Jane looked in the direction of the speaker. He had been sitting on a stool at the counter, sipping a cup of coffee. But now he was standing and walking toward the situation with a confident grace. "Don't apologize. He had it coming, and if you say you're sorry when you know you're not, you'll only regret it." "How'd you like to have a big piece of regret?" challenged the trucker. He took a step toward the man who had spoken. "This ain't your business." The man reached into his jacket, pulled out an official-looking ID, and flipped it open. "Threatening an agent of the FBI is a federal offense, friend." Then he snapped it closed. The trucker promptly seemed to wither as he stepped back and said, "Yeah, well, whatever. Forget the apology." "And forget this, too," snapped Mary Jane, yanking off her apron. "Take this job and shove it, Enrique." She tossed him the apron and stormed out the door as Enrique called after her, "Don't bother using me for a reference." Mary Jane stomped into the street, and, a moment later, the man who had intervened was at her side. "You did the right thing," he assured her. "Yeah, well, we'll see how right it is when I don't have money for the rent." "Nice of you to jump in, though. What were you doing in there? You're a lot classier than the guys we usually get." "Actually, I was killing time waiting for the auto club. My car battery died." "Oh!" Mary Jane looked where he was pointing. A tow truck had come around the corner and was pulling up in front of a red sports car that was parked at an angle at curbside. "I can give you a lift as soon as the car's up and running," he said. "That'd be great, actually. So, being a Fed must pay pretty well if you can afford such a nice car." "Oh, Lord, no, I'm not a Fed. I just asked him if he knew threatening an FBI agent was a federal offense. I never said I was one." She gaped a moment and then laughed. "Then what did you flash at him?" "My pilot's license." "You're a pilot?" "Occasionally. Actually, I'm an astronaut." "Wow. That's even cooler than being a Fed." "I've always thought so," he said. He extended a hand. "John Jameson." "Mary Jane Watson." And she shook his hand firmly. Jonah Jameson was laughing at his son's audacity. MJ thought he had a very strange laugh, like a seal barking. "That's my son. Never afraid to jump to the rescue of a lady fair. And frankly, you didn't need that job. I'm sure you could do far better." "Actually, she's done much better," John assured him. "There's not only that billboard ad she told you about, but she's starring in a play." "It's not one of those new wave things that you have to take your clothes off for, is it?" Jonah asked suspiciously. "Trash like that is what's killing the theater." "It's pretty old wave, actually," she said. "Dad, it's the importance of being earnest." "Of course," said Jonah. "By what's his name? Thornton Wilder?" "Oscar Wilde," she corrected. Jonah looked at her suspiciously. "He was the fruit, right?" "Ah, well," he shrugged. "British. What else do you expect, right?" "You said it, Jonah," Mary Jane smiled, deriving endless amusement from watching John put his face in his hands and moan as quietly as he could manage. Jonah glanced at him. "What's your problem?" "I don't think you like the jumbo prawn appetizers." "Yeah, that tasted a little off to me, too," agreed Jonah. They made it all the way to dessert before Mary Jane finally decided to step deep into the fire and see just how burned she came away. "Jonah," she said, leaning forward with her fingers interlaced, "there's something I'm curious about." John looked at her with a trace of concern, sensing something was up. Jonah stopped sipping his coffee and leaned back, looking to be in an expansive mood.
"What would that be, my dear?"
"Spider-Man."
"Ah!"
Jameson moaned and put the coffee down.
"While I was eating, you brought him up?"
"Spider-Man's kind of a sore subject as far as my dad is concerned," John said, obviously hoping Mary Jane would drop it. But she had no intention of doing so. "Well, I was just curious, that's all. I've seen all the articles, the editorials, and I was just wondering, what he ever did to you."
"What makes you think he ever did anything to me?"
"You write about him so much."
"He sells newspapers, Mary Jane," Jameson told her. "That's the single and sole reason he's occupied as many column inches as he has."
"But the slant, your editorials."
"I call them as I see them."
I guess I wonder why you see it that way." Mary Jane saw that John was making throat-cutting gestures, mutely pleading with her to end the discussion. "But if you don't want to talk about it, I understand."
"Mary Jane," said Jameson, "you can search high and low for the rest of your days and you will never, ever find a topic I don't want to talk about. You see that son of mine?" And he pointed at John. "He's a hero. A real hero."
"Dad, I'm just a guy doing a job."
"You're a hero," John said firmly. "Policemen, firemen, they're heroes. Men who follow the president around day after day ready to take a bullet for him, they're heroes. And you know why, Mary Jane? Because they lay it on the line."
He thumped his forefinger on the table with each word for emphasis.
"And my reporters, they lay it on the line. So do I. Every time we go after crooks or double dealers or power-mad politicians in the Daily Bugle, the name or the person or persons who wrote the piece is right there in black and white. You know what that's called?"
"The byline?"
"No. Well, yes, but no. What I meant was, it's called personal responsibility. Taking responsibility for your actions and standing up for what you do. Spider-Man doesn't do that."
"He doesn't?" she asked, wide-eyed.
"No. He's no different than these idiots who creep around on the internet, writing vicious attacks and then hiding behind fake names."
"Well, I think he's a little different," Mary Jane pointed out. "I doubt a lot of those internet guys go swinging around Manhattan on webs."
"The principle's the same. The fact is that he goes around doing whatever he wants, wherever and whenever he wants, getting himself involved in situations best left to trained professionals such as policemen or firemen, and hides from any mistakes he might make in doing so behind a red mask. The way society manages to survive is through checks and balances. Policemen, for instance, are answerable to boards of review, internal affairs, systems set up to make sure they don't abuse their power. You know why? Because as Chairman Mao said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely."
"Actually, it was Lord Acton," Mary Jane delicately corrected him. "And what he said was that power tends to corrupt. It doesn't always. I mean, look at all the power you have, Jonah. A newspaper, millions of readers who are influenced by every word you write. You shape opinion for the majority of people in the city. Are you saying that you've become corrupted by that power?"
"There are checks and balances on my power as well," Jonah pointed out. "Laws against libel, for instance."
"Which Spider-Man could never make use of, since he's a public figure and you're just stating opinion. Plus, he'd have to reveal his identity in order to sue you, which you know he won't do. Really, there's no check or balance on you at all. So I'm asking again, do you think you might be corrupted by the power you wield as publisher of the Bugle?"
"I have 47 years as a journalist, young lady," Jameson said slowly. "Going back to when I was a paper boy. That's a lot of years learning how to be fair and balanced. So no, I don't believe power has corrupted me."
"Then isn't it possible that the same goes for Spider-Man?" she asked. There was a long silence at the table, and then John said softly, "Still think she's a treasure, Dad?" "Maybe he's thinking about burying me," said Mary Jane.
No, Jonah assured her. "Actually, I like a challenge. Keeps me on my toes." I've been answering a lot of questions for you, young lady. Now you answer one for me. What's your personal interest in Spider-Man?
What makes you think I have any?
Because you've got a fire in your belly, sadly lacking in much of today's youth. And I'm thinking it's there for a reason. As I said, 47 years of journalism. You seem to think you've got a better handle than I do on Spider-Man. Why?
Maybe because he saved my life.
John turned and gaped at her. You never told me that.
She shrugged. You never asked. Who asks something like that?
Of course, Jameson said abruptly. If you were with young Osborn when the Green Goblin attacked, Spider-Man showed up for that.
And stopped me from falling to my death when the balcony collapsed, yes. And some instinct stopped her then, preventing her from talking about the other times Spider-Man had saved her. That time when she'd almost been mugged, or from the dizzying heights of the 59th Street Bridge. Somehow he'd always been there when she needed him, and she was wary enough not to want a journalist curious as to exactly why that was the case. She was concerned that it might lead to questions she couldn't answer, and answers she might not appreciate. Hell, she could just see the headline, Masked Menace Stalks Actress.
And what? Prompted Jonah.
And I was grateful, she said.
Tell me this then, Mary Jane, said Jonah. Did it ever occur to you that maybe, just maybe, Spider-Man might have been working with the Green Goblin?
That's ridiculous.
Why? Oldest con game in the world. Mr. Smith threatens the Mark, Mr. Jones steps in and stops Mr. Smith, and collects the monetary gratitude of the grateful Mark. And then turns around and splits it with his partner, Mr. Smith.
Spider-Man doesn't take money.
How do you know that? Check his bank records, his tax returns? Furthermore, at the very least, he's a material witness to the Goblin's crimes. Did he cooperate with the police investigations as any good citizen would? No. He hid. He hides because he has something to hide, Mary Jane.
Maybe he's just worried about recriminations against family and friends.
A risk taken by every district attorney who ever prosecuted a powerful felon. And yet they don't feel the need to operate outside the law. Spider-Man does. And as long as he feels that need, the Daily Bugle will point it out.
He paused, and then, to her surprise, rested a hand atop hers in a manner that actually seemed conciliatory.
Understand something. You obviously make my boy happy. And because you make him happy, that goes a long way toward making me happy. And I'm willing to accept the notion that Spider-Man is responsible for your surviving to make my son happy. In that respect, I fully understand your point of view regarding him. But that's not going to change the fact that when it comes to making people aware of Spider-Man's potential for nefarious designs, I have a job to do. And nothing can stop me from doing it.
I understand that, Jonah, she said amicably. Then again, maybe you have more in common with Spider-Man than you think.
How do you figure that?
Well, maybe he likewise feels he has a job to do, and nothing can stop him from doing it. Chapter 3. Spider-Man hated his job, and wished for the 100th time that day that he didn't have to do it. It had been 2 weeks since he'd rescued Otto Octavius from his airborne kidnapping, and his life had settled back into its standard abnormal pace. Actually, it wasn't Spider-Man having the job-related frustration so much as it was the costumed Peter Parker swinging in midair through the concrete canyons of New York City. He pondered the many uses to which he'd put his miraculous spider powers. With such abilities as his strength, his speed, his spider sense, the webbing that shot from his arms, why, he had stopped madmen in their tracks, saved plummeting tram cars, rescued countless people from falls or from being crushed by gigantic oncoming objects or from fires, or from bank robbers, or bullies, or rapists. The fact that he had accomplished so much wasn't what daunted and haunted him. It was that he couldn't get movies out of his mind. In movies, as sequels progressed, the hero always found himself facing greater and greater obstacles. Not that Peter thought of his life as a movie. He wasn't insane, he knew better than that. He knew that his life, however over the top it had become, was still his life. But what if life imitated art? Sometimes he would lie awake, imagining the stakes rising like floodwaters. What new dangers awaited him? What tremendous new challenges would be hurled at him? What dazzling new exploit would the amazing Spider-Man be required to pull off next? Somehow, in all his midnight ruminations, delivering pizza at web-slinging speed never cropped up. Life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. The John Lennon line flitted through Peter's mind with the same alacrity that he torpedoed across the skyline, deftly balancing a distressingly high stack of pizza boxes on one hand. He had taken the precaution of webbing the boxes together so they wouldn't skid off, but it was still a superhuman feat keeping them flat as he bounded from building to rooftop to building again. Then again, superhuman was pretty much his stock in trade. It had certainly been his stock in trade less than an hour ago, when he'd been sporting this very costume and swinging up toward a dangling construction worker. As rescues went, it seemed as if it was going to be pretty tame, spiraling gracefully upward and snagging the worker who was clinging to an I-beam, holding on for dear life. It was only upon Peter's high-flying arrival that matters took an abrupt turn for the worse, as it turned out that the I-beam wasn't properly anchored. It slipped from its moorings, and the construction worker tumbled off. As a result, Peter gaped in horror through the lenses of his Spider-Man mask as the worker went falling in one direction, and the I-beam went tumbling in another. The crowd below, screaming, didn't know which way to run. Those who weren't crushed by the I-beam would be trampled in the stampede of frightened humanity. Maybe that spider bite should have given me extra arms as well, he thought grimly, and then regretted even coming up with the notion. It would be just his luck if fate overheard the passing thought and said, "You want it, you got it. Ba-bing, ba-boom." Next thing he knows, he's toting around 4 extra limbs to give him a grand total of 8. Go try to hide that under a windbreaker, why don't you? His straying thoughts didn't slow his movements one bit. Anyone watching would have seen Spider-Man course-correct without hesitation, swinging on his web line and angling toward the falling I-beam. A huge glob of webbing fired from his wrists, enveloping the beam. And then Spider-Man's trajectory took him feet first right into the beam. He struck it squarely, sending it bounding back toward the skeleton of the building under construction. The I-beam slammed against the structure, the webbing adhered to the surface, and there the beam stuck. It was only a temporary fix, but it was all he needed. Once the construction worker was squared away, he could come back and properly attend to the I-beam. However, at that moment he was in a hurry. Using the momentum from impacting the I-beam, Spider-Man hurtled toward the falling construction worker. The man was thrashing about, screaming. He'd only been plummeting about 2 seconds, but the way he was flailing around, he wasn't going to last much longer. The free fall would cause him to snap his spine or neck before he dropped another 100 feet. Having already released his hold on his web line, Spider-Man straightened his body, dropping like a missile, and fired a cocoon of webbing at the worker. His aim was pinpoint and perfect. In a heartbeat, the man was wrapped top to bottom in webbing. Unfortunately, he was still falling. So was Spider-Man, but that was quickly attended to as he tightened his strands upon the following worker, even as he fired another web line. It snagged on the front of the billboard, and he swung toward it. As he did so, he snapped the trailing web line, and the worker rolled up toward him like a yo-yo. With a thump, Spider-Man landed on the billboard, with the worker, still screaming, not yet realizing that he was safe, tucked under his arm. He stared at the billboard. Mary Jane Watson stared back at him. He couldn't believe it. Beneath his mask, Peter Parker wanted to guffaw, but this was hardly the time. Instead, ignoring the irony, he crawled over Mary Jane's face and settled the worker onto the rooftop. The man had finally stopped screaming and had passed out. It was a huge billboard. Mary Jane, her eyes literally gigantic, was gazing out at an undeserving populace. The logo read, Emma Rose Parfumery. As Spider-Man began to unwind his webbing from the unconscious worker, he felt a wave of almost Shakespearean melancholy falling upon him. Adopting the appropriately grave demeanor, He turned to the senseless worker and intoned, "I have been stung by fate. I am its prisoner. A prisoner of my own conscience. My love for the girl I want, always to be locked within me." He glanced once more at the billboard. "With me, she's always in danger from those who fight against me. Without her, I travel a lonely road. My story will always be about the loss of a girl." He ceased his work and pointed at her. "That girl, Mary Jane Watson. And every day I ask myself, how long can I endure this loneliness?" He stopped talking and exhaled a heavy sigh. I know. More lachrymose than you'd expect from your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Guess we all have our off days, though. So never your mind. Just keep on sleeping. I have an I-beam to get squared away." And with that, Spider-Man fired a web line and swung over toward the still precarious girder. All of that had transpired a little more than half an hour earlier. Consequently, when Peter pulled up in front of a seedy rat trap of a restaurant called Joe's Pizza over on McDougal Street in the Village, his mind was elsewhere. Specifically, it was on another one of those same billboards with MJ's face adorning it, staring down at the pizza place in a manner that Peter might have almost be inclined to call protective, if he were given to flights of fancy. Now dressed in his civilian clothes, Peter sat astride a small motorcycle. His Aunt May had had a fit when she'd first learned he was tooling around on such a death trap. He'd sworn to her he'd always drive responsibly, and never over 20 miles an hour. He suspected she didn't believe that last part, but they maintained an unspoken agreement to let it stand. Peter was rolling up to curbside, staring up at the billboard, reflecting on the things he'd said earlier to the unconscious construction worker. "Is this what I'm reduced to?" Peter wondered. "So desperate to have someone to talk to that I chatted up with people who can't hear me? But really, what other choice do I have? There are things I have happening in my life, and no one I can talk to about them. That's just the way it is when the world knows you as Spider-Man, but everyone you love only knows you by the name of Peter Parker!" Peter nearly toppled off his cycle, but was instantly righted himself. Standing outside the pizza parlor was the owner, one Rahi Aziz, dark-haired and of indeterminate Middle Eastern descent. Aziz was flustered and frustrated, and didn't hesitate to make Peter aware that he was the cause. With one hand, he was pointing angrily at Peter. With the other, he was waving to the banner over the front wall that said, "Our oven to your door, 29 minutes or it's free." "Parker!" he shouted a second time. "You're late, man! Always late!" "Sorry, Mr. Aziz," said Peter. "There was a man about to die, and he was going to take a sizable portion of the crowd with him, and I saved him, me, with the strength and powers in these two arms. Whose life have you saved today?" "Yeah, that would help the situation big time." "Disturbance," Peter finished, displaying far less conviction than when he'd started. Aziz stared at him, giving him as much credence as if Peter had just said the dog ate his homework, or that his grandmother had died for the 5th time. "Another disturbance, always a disturbance." His expression warred briefly between amused incredulity and unfettered annoyance. Unfortunately for Peter, the annoyance won out. "One more chance," Aziz said, waving a finger in the air. 21 minutes ago, in comes an order from Hamilton, Burton and Smith, Woolworth Building. 17 extra-large deep-dish pizzas. Peter's heart was sinking with every new tidbit of information. He'd delivered to HB&S. They were cranky and demanding customers. The Woolworth Building was many blocks downtown. 17? How could this possibly get worse? "In 8 minutes... continued Aziz, answering Peter's unspoken question, "I am defaulting on Joe's 29-minute guarantee. Then, not only will I be receiving no money for these pizzas, but I will lose the customer forever to Pizza Yurt." "Why didn't you send Salim?" Peter asked, trying to find a way around the onerous task. Aziz was already in motion, grabbing pizzas being brought out to him by sweating chefs from the restaurant. "Salim was deported yesterday," said Aziz briskly, shoving the pizza into Peter's arms.
I have no hope but you. You have to make it in time. He kept stacking pizzas to the point where Peter couldn't see over the top of them. All the while, he kept talking. You're a nice young man, Peter, but you are not dependable. This is the last chance I can give you. You must cross 42 blocks in 7½ minutes, or your ass is fired. Not entirely sure why he was even bothering, Peter shot a glance at the clock on the wall of Joe's Pizza. It read 1:52. The banner with the 29-minute guarantee on it flapped in the wind. Peter couldn't help but feel that since it was Joe's bright idea to issue that guarantee, why shouldn't he be the one to undertake the impossible task that had just been set out? He'd met Joe once. Huge, beefy guy, could barely move his arms anymore because of all the flab hanging from them. Picturing that guy trying to dash 42 blocks in less than 8 minutes was an extremely entertaining mental image. It did not, however, bring Peter all that much amusement. Not when he was weaving his way through bumper-to-bumper midtown traffic. He wasn't in danger of falling off his cycle, someone whose balance was so precise that he could walk across a web strand stretched 50 stories high wasn't about to take a header off a motorbike. But buildings didn't try to hit you. They were comfortingly steady. In this case, Peter had to remain hyper-aware of taxis, crazy New York drivers, and even crazier out-of-state drivers, all of whom seemed determined to cut him off whenever possible. Plus, he had to watch the angles of his turns. Although the pizzas were strapped to a rack behind him, they could still slide within the boxes. He didn't want to deliver 17 pizzas, all of them with the cheese piled to one side. All the while, he knew that he was hemorrhaging time. He darted between two cars, zipped around a hesitant truck, and suddenly he was out in the open, ahead of the traffic jam. His heart soared. Naturally, that was when his bike stalled out. He couldn't believe it. And yet, depressingly, he somehow could believe it, all too readily. He kicked wildly at the starter, hoping against hope that he'd catch one of the most ephemeral and hard-to-snag things of all. A brake. Didn't happen. The bike didn't even cough or sputter. It just sat there under him, affording him as much transportation as a paperweight. Peter's head snapped around, and he looked up at a large digital clock outside of a bank. It read 1:57. He didn't know if the clock was in sync with the other at Joe's, but he couldn't take the chance. With a quick yank, he snapped the cord holding the pizzas to the back of the motorbike. Then he ran down a nearby alleyway, moving as fast as he could considering the circumstances. Once inside the alleyway, he yanked off his outer clothing. Then, having webbed the pizza boxes together, he fired a web strand to an overhanging ledge. It snagged on the underside. An instant later, he was drawing himself up the web line as fast as he could go. From behind him, he heard shouts, "It's Spider-Man!" called out one person, and another called out, "He stole that guy's pizzas!" He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At least no one had ID'd him. They'd apparently been too dense for that, missing the obvious conclusion in favor of a determination that made him, Spider-Man, look bad. The problem was that these days people always seemed more than willing to believe the worst of him, mostly thanks to J. Jonah Jameson and his incessant attacks in the Daily Bugle. No time to dwell on it, though. Instead, he was too busy enjoying the convenience and freedom that his Spider-Man persona provided him. All the people crammed onto the sidewalks, all the cars lined up waiting for interminable red lights, and scores of jaywalkers. When he was Spider-Man, it was almost as if they were a different species. Or maybe he was. Well, that would explain the incessant suspicion, now wouldn't it? He pulled his mind away from such depressing notions to concentrate on the business at hand. As opposed to his first tentative and, frankly, catastrophic efforts, web swinging had become so second nature to him now that he didn't need to pay attention to what he was doing. That was under ordinary circumstances, though, and these were hardly ordinary. Here he had one hand occupied, the other attending to the pizzas. So he had to swing in an arc, release the web line, and then free fall until he could fire another web line and anchor it once more. Swinging in such a manner couldn't help but slow him down, at a time when he needed speed more than ever. But he had no choice. Something he noticed out of the corner of his eye snagged his full attention.
A couple of young boys had been practicing dribbling a basketball on the sidewalk while preparing to cross the street to a basketball court on the other side. One boy had tried to snag the ball from the other, and it had rebounded into the street. With the feckless belief in their own immortality that characterized the typical 8-year-old, they dashed after the ball, heedless of the Mack truck that was bearing down upon them. High above, Peter didn't hesitate. He tossed the pizzas in the direction of a nearby rooftop, not even wanting to think about what the condition of the pies was going to be when he retrieved them. But he had no choice. Having divested himself of his cargo, he aimed a web lasso at the kids, even as he angled down toward them. The web line fell around them, snagging them, and the startled kids were yanked to the opposite side of the street as the truck shot past them, horn blasting. The kids lay on the sidewalk, bewildered, and then they looked up to see Spider-Man crouched atop a lamppost. He waggled a scolding finger and said, "No playing in the street." Numb, the best they could manage was a, "Yes, Mr. Spider-Man." But Peter barely heard it, because he was already off, swinging up toward the roof, where he prayed the pizzas were intact. As it so happened, they almost weren't. Miraculously, the boxes had survived the drop. Peter chalked that up to the durability of Joe's boxes, so heavily corrugated that a Panzer division could roll over them and do only minimal damage. A moocher had made the scene, however. It was a heavy-set man, apparently hanging up some laundry, who had dropped what he was doing and made a beeline for the heaven-sent pies. He'd pried open the top box and was holding a slice of plain cheese pizza in his thick hands, about to shove it into his mouth. Then his eyes widened at the sight of a lithe blue and red form descending from on high and heading right for him. He managed a strangled gasp, and then Spider-Man snagged the pizza boxes with a web line and hurtled skyward. The man watched him go, his mouth still wide, thanks to the fact that his jaw had gone slack. Finally, he looked at the slice still in his hand, except a web line zipped in and snagged the whole remaining slice by the crust and whipped it from his hand. Pausing only long enough to shove the slice back into the box and web the container shut, Peter covered the remaining distance to the Woolworth building at such breathtaking speed that he thought he was going to outfly his own costume. His destination loomed in front of him, and he snagged the pinnacle of the building with a web line. He arced around it, the world blurring past him, and then landed on the roof. He didn't know what time it was. He didn't want to know. He eschewed the idea of changing back to his clothes right there. It was too narrow, and it would be just his luck if some idiot tourist with a telescopic lens wrecked his secret for him. Instead, he went directly to the maintenance panel on the roof that was used to gain access to the elevator shaft. From that point, it was a quick slide down to the cables and through the trapdoor on the top of the waiting elevator car. Pushing the button for the 25th floor, he clung to the top of the car, keeping the pizzas close to him. The instant the doors opened, he moved like a literal blue streak, scuttling across the ceiling while the bewildered receptionist stared into an empty elevator and scratched her head. Moments later, Peter Parker, back in his regular clothing, emerged from a janitor's closet. He held the pizzas aloft and called out, "Pizza time!" The receptionist stared up at him like a dead fish as he brushed away strands of web. Then she said nothing, but simply glanced in the direction of the clock over her head. It read 2:03. He forced his smile wider. It was in inverse proportion to the degree of happiness he felt. "Hey, come on," he said wheedlingly. "What's 5 extra minutes between friends, huh?" As it turned out, the receptionist was not his friend. "Joe's 29-minute guarantee is a promise, man!" An apoplectic Aziz was shouting in Peter's face. "I know a promise means nothing to you, Parker, but to me it is serious." Aziz wasn't even trying to keep his voice down, and passersby were glancing in Peter's direction as the manager stood on the sidewalk outside the pizza parlor and chewed him out. His words stung Peter. If there was one thing he believed in strongly, it was promises. A promise had shaped the course of his life. The promise he had made at the graveside of his uncle, Ben Parker, never to allow through inaction an innocent to come to harm. The sacrifices he'd had to make because of that promise, the risks he had taken, the danger he faced on a daily basis. In comparison, pizza delivery was an inconsequential pastime. Unfortunately, it was an inconsequential pastime that paid the bills. Peter bit back the anger he felt and managed to keep his voice even as he said, "It's serious to me too, Mr. Aziz." Aziz wasn't even listening to him. "You're fired." "Give me another chance," Peter said, knowing already what the answer was going to be before it was spoken. "No more chances," Aziz thundered. "You're fired! Fired!" At least this day can't get any worse, Peter thought bleakly, and promptly he mentally kicked himself. "You're fired," J. Jonah Jameson informed Peter Parker at his customary decibel level. Unlike the passerby at the pizza place, not a single bugle staffer bothered to glance in the direction of Jameson's office. Not only were they busy at their own jobs, rushing to meet their deadlines before the late edition went out, but they'd simply learned to tune out Jameson's tantrums. It was much the same as people living under a busy elevated train track who learned not to notice the train thundering overhead every 5 to 7 minutes. That didn't stop Peter from feeling as if he were under a microscope. His head slouched, his shoulders practically collapsed in on themselves. He looked so withdrawn that Jameson must have thought for a moment that he'd let his attention wander. "Hello, Parker!" he bellowed, and when he was sure once again that he had Peter's undivided attention, repeated, "You're fired." "Why?" demanded a frustrated Peter. The truth was, he suspected he knew what Jameson was going to say, but he was stalling for time, hoping to come up with a handful of pithy rebuttals. Unfortunately for him, Jameson opted for the truism that a picture was worth 1,000 words, and he chose to use Peter's photos to pile on the words. Peter had been lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time and snap pictures of Spider-Man in action, but the situation had palled for him, and he had tried his hands at other photo subjects. Jameson didn't appear interested. He was motoring through the stacks of photos on his desk, ashes falling on them from the cigar he had clenched between his teeth. Dogs catching frisbees? Pigeons in the park? A couple of old geezers playing chess? Betty Brandt, Jameson's secretary, stuck her head in. Reflexively, her nose wrinkled at the cigar smell. The stench wafting through the air rendered Jameson's office very uncomfortable to anyone who still happened to possess olfactory senses, or even lungs. "Boss," she said. "What?" snapped Jameson, peering through the haze of smoke, obviously uncertain as to where the voice had originated. His eyes narrowed as he spotted her. "Not now." Jameson's preoccupation with shredding Peter's hopes of a sale was once again stymied, however, as city editor Joe Robbie Robertson strode into Jameson's office, with advertising manager Ted Hoffman practically nipping at his heels. Hoffman started to open his mouth, but Robbie cut him off with a brusque, "I said I'd take care of it," and turned to Jameson in an endeavor to keep Hoffman silent. "We've got 6 minutes to deadline, Jonah. We need page 1. Hoffman took a fast step around Robbie and said in a reedy voice, "The university president's furious." Robbie fired him an annoyed look. Jameson just looked bored. "Why?" "Your editorial says he's not even fit to teach kindergarten," Hoffman explained, glancing nervously in Robbie's direction. "Print a retraction," barked Jonah Jameson, and Hoffman looked clearly relieved, until Jameson continued, "He is fit to teach kindergarten." Hoffman moaned softly and walked out of the office. No doubt he was envisioning the university's regular full-page advertising going the way of the dodo. Jameson, meantime, appeared to have forgotten Hoffman. Instead, he turned his energies and diatribes back upon the hapless Peter. "Parker, I don't pay you to be a sensitive artiste." Betty looked helplessly at Peter, obviously wanting to get him off the hook somehow. "Boss," she said more forcefully. She would have required the force of a wrecking ball to get Jameson off track. "Still not now," he said. Betty shrugged helplessly and walked out. Peter desperately wished she'd stayed. He could use whatever support he could get, even if it was the mute, moral kind. Jameson, meantime, hadn't paused. "I pay you because for some reason that psycho Spider-Man will pose for you." "Spider-Man won't let me take any more pictures of him," replied Peter. "You've turned the whole city against him." Jameson leaned back in his chair, his hands behind his head. His cigar migrated from one side of his mouth to the other, apparently on its own.
A fact I'm very proud of. Now, get your pretty little portfolio out of my sight. He swept the pictures aside with one hand. Before I go into a diabetic coma. The intercom buzzed. Reflexively, Jameson hit the button and Betty's voice filtered through. Boss, your wife's on line 1. She says she can't find her checkbook.
Thanks for the good news, replied Jameson and shut off the intercom. Peter used the brief pause in Jameson's diatribe to jump in and try to appeal to Jameson's very likely non-existent compassion. Mr. Jameson, please, aren't there any of these shots you can use? I really need the money. Jameson responded pretty much the way Peter had expected. Aww. Obviously dissatisfied with the outcome of her intercom end run, Betty strode back into the office. Before she could get a word out, Jameson swiveled in his chair and said, Miss Brandt, get me a violin. Robertson, who hadn't budged the entire time, simply stood there with his arms folded, maintaining patience honed through long years of practice. 5 minutes to deadline, Jonah. Jameson turned to Robbie, and then noticed that Peter hadn't left.
What? Why are you still here? Oh, devil take it. Anything so I don't have to look at that clubbed baby seal expression.
He grabbed one of the pictures at random and flung it at Robertson, who caught it.
Stick this in an empty space on the paper, toward the back, on the obits.
2 old men playing chess in the obituaries? Asked Robertson.
With any luck, one or both of them are dead by now, Jameson said, scribbling out a voucher. Besides, it's symbolic, like in that Ingrid Bergman film.
Ingmar, said Peter. Jonah was holding up the voucher he just filled out and he glared at Peter.
You want this?
Ingrid Bergman is my favorite director, Peter said immediately, and snatched the voucher from Jameson's outstretched hand. He was out of the office before Jonah could rethink his actions. Quickly, he went to Betty's desk and handed her the voucher. Hi, he said, waiting for her to open the cash drawer. Betty barely had to glance at it. Sorry, Pete, this doesn't even cover the advance you got 2 weeks ago. His heart sank. He'd forgotten about it. Oh, right. He sighed. Then he glanced at the clock on her desk, and his stomach sank somewhere into his shoes. Jameson had kept him waiting so long that he totally lost track of time, and now he was running terribly late. Thanks anyway, gotta go. And he was out the door, down in the street, and literally motoring toward the university campus. Briefly, he considered web-swinging over there, but lately it seemed every time he crawled into the costume, disaster struck. Better to just stick to normal means of getting around for the time being. Upon arriving at the campus, he parked his motorbike and sprinted across the grounds. From the way people were gaping at him, he realized that he was moving far faster than any normal person should be going. But he didn't have time to slow down. If anything, he sped up. He hurtled around the corner of the science building, backpack flapping against his spine, and at the last split second his spider sense warned him that there was an obstruction in his path. His instinct was to somersault over it, but he fought it, and instead managed to brake to a halt at the last instant. It wasn't enough to avoid impact, however, because the obstruction had kept moving. Consequently, they collided, sending papers and books flying everywhere. Peter pulled himself together quickly, looked up, and saw that he had slammed into the very last person with whom he'd want to have such a violent encounter. Oh, hey! Wow, Dr. Connors! Sorry. Peter immediately bent down to help the one-armed professor gather his fallen study materials. Where were you headed, Parker? Demanded a clearly annoyed Connors. To your class. My class is over. See me? And he pointed at his own head. Standing here? Peter felt his face burning with embarrassment. I'm sorry, Dr. Connors. I lost track of time. Connors shook his head, and when he spoke, it wasn't scoldingly, but more with an air of disappointment. I don't think it's time you've lost track of. I think maybe you've lost track of your life. He held up individual fingers, counting off the instances as he went. Your grades have been steadily declining. You're late for class. You always appear exhausted. That paper on fusion is still overdue. At that moment, Peter saw a chance to solve 2 problems at one time. He'd given no thought whatsoever to the paper on fusion, but he knew who was doing the most breakthrough work on that most elusive of energy sources. Otto Octavius. Octavius, whom a now dead merc had accused of being involved in the production of some sort of dangerous armament. Here was an opportunity to legitimately take time to explore whether Octavius was really up to something untoward, and get graded for it. It was like one of those schools where you get credit for life experience. "I'm planning to write it on Dr. Otto Octavius," he told Connors. "Planning is not a major at this university. Finish that paper, or I'm failing you." He started to turn away, then paused and glanced at Peter with a reflective look. "The great Octavius. He's a friend of mine. Better do your research. Get your facts straight, Parker." That final admonition left Peter wondering just what the hell he was doing to himself, and why he was doing it. It wasn't that he'd lost track of his life. It's that he was trying to live a second life, and it wasn't exactly meshing with the first. But before he could dwell on it further, he noticed that the clock tower said it was 1 minute to 6. "Shoot!" he yelled, and he was gone. If it had seemed to the casual observer that he was running with amazing speed before, that was nothing compared to the burst he displayed now. Anyone seeing him wouldn't have seen him so much as notice something out of the corner of their eye and then wonder where it had gone. He vaulted onto his motorcycle and ripped out into Manhattan traffic, barreling between cars, using every ounce of his spider-like agility. He made it to Forest Hills in 21 minutes flat, which was 20 minutes later than he'd promised Aunt May he'd be there. He glided the cycle to a stop, jumped off, and moved quickly to the front door. He threw it open and stepped into the living room. And that's when, screaming, they leapt out at him. Chapter 4. Surprise! Peter did everything he could to maintain a startled expression, even though he'd long ago figured out that his aunt, May Parker, was planning this party for him. She was a dear woman and skilled at many things, but duplicity wasn't her strong suit. She telegraphed her plans in 100 different ways. The only thing Peter was left wondering was who the heck she'd invite, considering he hardly saw anyone these days, unless he was either rescuing them or webbing them up to be left for the police. So there was a genuine element of surprise for him as his former roommate, Harry Osborn, and Mary Jane leapt out at Mary Jane. It was all he could do not to melt at the sight of her, with that gorgeous grin and the flaming red hair that danced around her face. From near his shoulder, Aunt May was urging him. "Well, say something!" Was all he could manage, and then he forced his attention away from Mary Jane, itself a Herculean feat. He smiled broadly. "What's the occasion?" "Really, Peter," said May with an affectionate scold. "It's your birthday, whether you wish to remember it or not." "Peter lives in another reality, don't you, Pete?" Mary Jane asked coyly. "Yeah, I think living in a reality that includes scrambling up the sides of buildings and swinging from threads could qualify as another in the reality biz." Oh yeah, that was just the thing to say. Mary Jane cocked her head slightly, as if sensing the thoughts tumbling through his mind. "Long time no see." He managed a nod. "Hi, MJ." "Peter's also a photographer," Harry said with an almost fraternal pride as he draped an arm around Peter's shoulder. But when he spoke again, his voice was infected with an obviously false cheerfulness. "Spider-Man's photographer. How is the bug these days?" "Haven't seen him lately," Peter said, feeling very uncomfortable. And why shouldn't he have felt uncomfortable? Harry was convinced Spider-Man had killed his father, and Peter had no way of convincing him otherwise. None that wouldn't compromise his secret at any rate. Aunt May made a dismissive wave of her hand. "The less you see of that man, the better. Peter, let's have some punch." She had moved to a punch bowl and was ladling out her famous fruit drink. "Let's celebrate all the good. MJ's in a Broadway play." "Off-Broadway," Mary Jane corrected her. "It's just a little part. Harry sent me roses," she added, clearly grateful. Harry bobbed his head in acknowledgement. MJ had been his girlfriend in the past, so it was nice to know they were still getting on, even though the relationship had ended. "How lovely, Harry," May said approvingly, and handed him a glass of punch. "And you're at Oscorp, doing things that would make your father proud, rest his soul." "I'm in charge of special projects," Harry said. "We're finding one of your idols, Pete, Otto Octavius." "I'm writing a paper on him," said Peter, taking a glass of punch. "Want to meet him?" Peter could scarcely believe it. This was just simplifying matters so much that it can completely wreck his hard-won, hard-luck image. "You'd introduce me?" "You bet," said Harry, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. "Octavius is going to put Oscorp on the map in a way my father never even dreamed of." "What a lovely birthday present," May said. "Okay, does somebody want to help me in the kitchen? MJ?" Mary Jane looked slightly startled, as if her thoughts had been elsewhere. On me? Peter wondered. As if. He had told her in no uncertain terms that all they would ever be, could ever be, was friends. And MJ was far too much the free spirit to hear no for an answer more than one time. Peter was sure she was back on the dating scene, with no looking back. As MJ followed May into the kitchen, Peter's gaze followed her. There was so much he wanted to say, and knew he couldn't. Harry leaned back against the banister, serenely confident. "She's waiting for you, pal." Peter was walking over to the desk to see if there was any mail for him. "What do you mean?" "Well, the way she looks at you, or doesn't look at you, however you want to look at it." At that, Peter chuckled. Harry certainly had all the angles covered. If she looked at him longingly or didn't give him a second glance, it meant the same thing. Don't have time to think about girls right now. As he said that, he paused. An envelope not addressed to him had caught his notice. It was from the mortgage company. Aunt May's mortgage company. The words "pre-eviction notice" were visible through the plastic-covered window in the envelope. "Why? Are you dead?" Harry asked skeptically. Peter wasn't even looking at him, his attention fully engaged by the less than sterling news in the envelope. "Been kind of busy. Taking pictures of your friend." That brought Peter's thoughts back to Harry. The ongoing topic of Spider-Man had already gone a good ways toward poisoning their relationship, and Peter had hoped that Harry would, at the very least, be able to rein himself in for this gathering. Obviously, this wasn't going to be the case. With more anger in his voice than he'd have liked, Peter said, "Could we get off that subject?" Taking a breath, trying to get back to being calm, he continued, "I want us to be friends, Harry. I want us to trust each other." "Be honest," said Harry levelly. "If you knew who he was, would you tell me?" Peter's tone was hollow. "You'd only want him dead." "Of course I would," Harry told him, having no idea how his words were wounding. "The same way you'd want the man who killed your Uncle Ben dead. My father loved you like a son, Pete." Harry paused and then seemed to remember where he was and the fact that they were supposed to be celebrating Peter's birthday. He draped an arm around Peter's shoulder. "Hey, I don't mean to rag on you. You're my buddy, you know that." "I understand. Call me tomorrow. I'll arrange for you to visit Otto." Peter looked at him askance. "You call him Otto?" Suddenly, the lights went out, and for a moment Peter tensed. Then Aunt May and Mary Jane came shuffling in from the kitchen, walking slowly as if in a processional, May bearing a birthday cake with "Happy Birthday, Peter" etched on it. May, Mary Jane, and Harry launched into a deliriously off-key rendition of "Happy Birthday to You." "My friend who hates me but doesn't know it, the girl who loves me but I can't afford to truly let her into my life, and my aunt who's being evicted. Oh yeah, life is good. Happy birthday to me," he thought glumly. Mary Jane had excused herself early from the party, leaving not long after the presents had been opened. Peter hadn't known how to feel about her departure. He was relieved because in some ways, talking to MJ was like a knife in his heart. But he was depressed because it was the sweetest pain he knew. So those same mixed feelings resurfaced later, after Harry had left, when Peter was hauling a bag of trash from the party into the back, and discovered Mary Jane standing on the other side of the fence in the backyard that belonged to the Watsons, Mary Jane's parents. On the one hand, he felt as if she'd been waiting there for him. On the other, he was concerned he'd wandered into her private musings. Well, if she wanted privacy, she always could have been inside her folks' house. She smiled awkwardly at him. It made him feel like he was back in high school, and that any conversation they had would be interrupted by Flash Thompson pulling up in his car and honking, drawing her away from him. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He paused, and then told her, "Saw your billboard on Bleecker." He'd also seen it uptown when he'd landed on it, but he saw no reason to add that nugget of information. "Isn't it funny? I'm really kind of embarrassed." "Don't be. It's nice." He smiled. "I get to see you every day now." Well, doesn't that sound pathetic? The only reason you don't see her every day in person is your own stupid choice. Mary Jane was compassionate enough not to point that out. Instead, she shrugged and said, "Photographer liked my face. I was only supposed to be in a catalog. Then I got this part in the play. Everything at once. Dreams come true. How about yours?" "I'm fine," he said in that guarded way that had become second nature to him. "I wish you'd come see the play. You're the one who always encouraged me," she said. "I plan to." She paused, and Peter braced himself. He knew it was coming. She was going to tell him how hurt she was that he'd shut her out of his life, about the frustration, the resentment, how even being with him tonight was torture and a huge mistake. "I liked seeing you tonight, Peter." He was so filled with relief he could barely stand. Oh boy, yeah. Oh boy, yeah. What? 100 responses filled his mouth, but all he came out with was nothing. Her blue eyes were locked onto him. "I know the feeling. Sometimes you want to say something, but it won't come out." It was as if they were both on stage and she was trying to guide him toward forgotten lines. "Do you want to say something?" "Do you?" he replied. "You first." It was insane. He'd thought he could keep them apart through sheer force of will, but it was like two magnets being drawn inexorably toward each other. Then Uncle Ben came to him. Not literally, but the mental image that haunted him day and night flashed through his thoughts. Just for a heartbeat. It was enough, though. That in turn opened the door to his view of her falling away from him, tossed off the top of the 59th Street Bridge by the Green Goblin. Once again it strengthened his resolve. Anyone close to him could be at risk. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't really deserve to be happy in the first place because of his great sin of omission. Because Uncle Ben was dead, and he was responsible. "I was wondering if, you're still in the village?" he asked. She stared at him, as if she'd been able to see the pictures running behind his eyes, and was trying to make sense of them. "You're such a mystery," she said. "Sometimes I just want to punch you and wake you up." He offered a shoulder to her. "Go ahead." She took a step closer and gently threw a tap to his jaw that couldn't have knocked over an origami swan. Then she said, "I gotta go. My mom's sick. You know, my dad left." "Yeah, I heard. I'm sorry." "Don't be." she said, her voice turning harsher. He was abusive and nasty and wasn't happy unless he was tearing me or my mom down. I know. That's what I'm sorry about. She shook her head and, sounding frustrated, said, Oh, Peter Parker. What? MJ was right up against the fence, and she reached over and brushed his hair back. He thought she was going to kiss him and realized that, right then, despite all the reasons it would be a bad idea, it was what he wanted more than anything. Instead, all she did was say, Happy birthday. She moved away from him then and started for the house. But she paused on the steps and, without turning, said, I'm seeing somebody now. Thinking that she was still dwelling on unresolved issues with her father, Peter said, Oh, therapy? That prompted her to turn and look at him suspiciously, trying to determine if he was making fun of her. When she saw the open curiosity on his face, she apparently realized that he was honest in his confusion. No, a person, a man. Peter's heart started racing. Well, that's what you expected. She wasn't going to wait around for the guy who made a point of keeping her at arm's length. You mean, like a boyfriend? Well, I like him, said Mary Jane. Oh. What? Keeping his outward cool, Peter said, No. No, it's good. Companionship? Maybe more than that. More? Her lips twitched. I don't know. Suddenly, it was desperately vital to Peter that he let Mary Jane know how important she was to him. Hey, I'm gonna come see her play tomorrow night. You're coming? She was visibly surprised. I'll be there. Do you want me to put a house seat aside for you? 3rd row center, prime spot? Absolutely. She seemed gratified. Don't disappoint me. I won't, he assured her. What the hell are you doing? Peter demanded silently of himself as Mary Jane walked back into her former home, while Peter walked into his. She's getting involved with someone else. It's what you wanted. She's moving on with her life, and now you're trying to insert yourself back into it? You push her aside and suddenly you can't let her go? What's your problem? And out loud, so far under his breath that no one could hear him, so softly he himself could barely hear, he said, I love you, Mary Jane. He walked into the dining room and saw that Aunt May had fallen asleep in a chair, a dish towel clutched in her hand like a security blanket. He watched her for a moment, then moved to the table and sat in a chair across from her. She seemed so peaceful, but he knew he couldn't just leave her there. Her back would never forgive her in the morning. He rested a hand atop hers and she awoke with a start. What? Ben? She gasped out, and in her confusion didn't see Peter flinch when she said it. She tried to focus on her surroundings. Oh, my, Wait. Aunt May? Peter? Then she laughed at her own bewilderment. Oh, for a second there, I thought it was years ago. Everybody's gone, aren't they? He nodded. Party's over. They both went home. She stood up with great certainty, as if she had many things she had to attend to. Well, now it was a very nice little birthday get-together, she said. Her voice sounded slightly sing-song, as if it wasn't quite connected to the world around them. Did they have a good time? I'm sure they did. You okay? Of course I am. But you go on home, she said, patting him on the upper arm. And be careful. I don't like that scooter thing you drive around. I'm worried about you, he said, making no effort to leave. You're alone, maybe too alone sometimes, and... He hesitated and then admitted, I saw the letter from the bank. She shrugged. So, I'm a little behind. Everyone is. As if that settled the matter, She moved toward her purse on the counter, situated between the birthday candles and a quart container of milk that was sitting open and mostly empty. As she put the remains of the milk away, her hand darted into the purse at the same time, sneaking something from it. She probably thought Peter didn't see the movement. She was mistaken. Then again, she couldn't know the difficulties of trying to elude the notice of someone with spider sense. Anyway, I don't wish to talk about it. I'm tired now, and you better start for home. Then she turned to him and stuffed into his palm what she'd taken out of the purse. A crumpled $20 bill. Here, she said. You need this more than I do. Happy birthday. Oh, Aunt May, I can't. And with a ferocity that startled Peter, she shot back, Yes, you can! You can take this money from me. For God's sake, it's not much. Now, it's a measly $20. Now take it! And don't you dare leave it here. Her anger was akin to an intense downpour. It wasn't capable of sustaining itself for long. She seemed to shrink at the end of the outburst and said, in a much lower voice, I'm sorry. Lost my temper. She was clearly fighting tears. Peter wanted to reach out to her, embrace her, but he sensed she would consider it patronizing somehow. Thin tears worked their way down the crags of her face as she said, It's just that I miss your uncle so much sometimes. Can you believe it will be 2 years next month that he was taken? She didn't wipe away the tears then. She just appeared to shut them off through willpower alone. I think to myself at times, were I to face the one responsible for what happened, I don't know what I would do. I hate to think what I might be capable of. Peter tried to keep the guilt from his eyes. Aunt May had found no closure at all for the death of Uncle Ben. The frustrating thing was, he knew perfectly well that the man responsible was dead. He had seen him fall to his death from the window of that warehouse down by the docks. But there had been no eyewitnesses to the carjacking that had cost Ben Parker his life. And when the police had arrived, they'd seen 2 distinct individuals moving in the windows of the warehouse that night. They didn't know for sure that the man who ended up a crumpled heap on the dock was the perpetrator of the crime. They suspected it, but couldn't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. There was always the possibility that the man whom they had spotted, but who had escaped, might have been the actual robber and killer. And Peter was hardly in a position to say, No, that was me, dressed in my wrestling costume. I avenged my uncle's death. You can close the books on this one. So the books remained open, and May Parker continued to suffer. He was about to say something to her, something to alleviate her pain. What it was, he didn't know. It might have been the last thing she needed to hear. As it turned out, he didn't get to say anything, because Aunt May had intercepted it. Oh, she exclaimed as she wiped her eyes with the birthday napkin. You better take some cake home. There was always room for cake. It was late at night, and Peter was feeling completely drained. He felt as if he'd started the day 100 hours ago. He locked up his bike and trudged up the stairs to the apartment he rented above a television repair shop. He walked past the slightly open door of his landlord, Mr. Dickovich. Had he chosen to do so, he could have moved with such stealth that Dickovich would never have detected his passing. But, considering the array of ups and downs, mostly downs, he'd experienced on this, the crappiest birthday ever, he simply strode in knowing that he would hear exactly what he did. Rent! Dickovich's voice thundered down the corridor. Peter stopped in his tracks as Dickovich kicked the door open wider. His TV was playing some reality programming involving sex-crazed couples. Dickovich's young daughter, Ursula, was visible behind him. Whereas her father was heavy-set and jowly, Ursula, who was in her mid-20s, must have taken after her mother. She was tall, lanky, and rail-thin, and when she looked at Peter, it was with an open interest that always served to make him feel uncomfortable. Hi, muttered Peter. Hi? What's hi? Did I spend it? I have a paycheck due this week, Peter lied. Dickovich didn't appear impressed. You're a month late again. Again. I promise to. His landlord blew air dismissively between his cracked lips. If promises were crackers, I'd be fat. You are fat, you slob. I'm really sorry, Mr. Dickovich. Reasoning that it was just another case of easy come, easy go, Peter pulled out the $20 from Aunt May and proffered it. I can give you 20 until next week. With the speed of a striking lizard, Dickovich snatched it from his hand. Sorry, doesn't pay the rent. And don't try to sneak past me. I have ears like a cat, eyes like a rodent. Thanks, Mr. Dickovich, said Peter, even though he didn't know what he was thanking the man for, and closed the door of his apartment behind him. He flopped onto the bed in the one-room dump, looking around at the still-packed boxes, the radiator, the second-hand desk. The starkness of the place was spruced up only by the array of photographs on his dresser. He missed the far nicer digs he'd shared with Harry, and would have continued to share had Harry not moved back into the townhouse now that his father was gone. It was a huge place, and Harry had invited Peter to move in as well, but Peter had declined. Harry's obsession with Spider-Man was already making things uncomfortable. Being subjected to it every day was more than he could stand. The pictures on the dresser represented some of his happiest memories. There were Aunt May and Uncle Ben smiling out at him, and there was a shot of Mary Jane that he'd taken at the spider display mere minutes before his life would be permanently altered by the bite of a stray mutated spider. His last moments of innocence, represented by MJ's glowing smile, frozen forever. He pulled the pillow over his head and fell into a restless slumber. I'm seeing somebody now. Damn, bitch. Sorry. That was a really, really tender moment, and then I ruined it.
There are two people in this scene named Jameson. How am I supposed to know? Oh, wait. They have different names, so why are we using the same last name, Mr. David? I don't get you. I'm sure you're a nice guy. Flashback. Flashback noises. I need water. I'm not getting water. It's too hot in there.
Nervous about my mic arm about to fall off. Come on, guys.
Oh, and there's my billboard.
Wait. Oh, Mary Jane said that. Boy, she got a lot of testosterone in the last couple seconds. Sorry.